Comprehensible input. If you've spent any time on YouTube looking for ways to learn English, you've probably heard this term hundreds of times in the last year alone. And lately, it feels like every other channel in this space is built entirely around comprehensible input. Just watch this, just listen to this. Don't study, don't force anything. Just expose yourself to English, and one day, English will just click for you. That is the general promise these channels make. But I need to say this clearly right at the beginning of this video. That promise is incomplete. Not fake, incomplete. Because comprehensible input is real. It's backed by real research. It really works. But it works up to a point. And if nobody tells you what that point is, you're going to hit it, you're going to get frustrated with yourself, and worse, you're going to think there's something wrong with you, with your ability to learn English well. But there isn't anything wrong with you. There's something wrong with the advice. So today, I want to do three things. First, I'm going to tell you exactly what comprehensible input is, where it comes from, and why it works as well as it does, especially early on in your journey. Second, I'm going to show you, with research and 20 years of watching real students, exactly where comprehensible input stops working and why. And third, and this is the part most people are not willing to say, I'm going to tell you what you actually need to add to comprehensible input if your goal is B2, C1, and C2 levels. Not a trick, but the real mix necessary for you to become successful at learning this language. And I'm also going to tell a little bit about my own personal story because I didn't learn English the way you would expect, and that might surprise you. So, are you ready? Let's get into it and have a great conversation today about comprehensible input. Before I go any further, quick mention here because everything we're going to be talking about today is relevant to this. Learning English and practicing English at this higher level now, B2 and C1 levels, can be hard to apply by yourself. What I mean by that is most learners don't know what topics to study next, when, how. If you're feeling a little bit lost and you don't know exactly how to get to a solid B2 level and beyond, the B2 Edge app closes that gap for you. The app gives you a structured daily curriculum targeting the B2 level and an AI speaking coach. You can talk to the coach, simulate real conversational scenarios there, get corrected, and get feedback from it. So if that sounds like a good idea to you, check out the app, link in the description, start the onboarding quiz, and get started with your plan today because, I think it's really going to help you reach a solid B2 level by giving you clarity on what to do and when. All right, so let's start with where this term even comes from, comprehensible input, because most of the YouTube videos using this term don't even explain this part, and that matters. Comprehensible input isn't a method, it's a hypothesis, one piece of a much bigger theory proposed by an American linguist named Stephen Krashen, and that was back in the late 1970s and early 80s. Krashen put forward 5 separate hypotheses trying to explain how people learn, acquire a second language. And the input hypothesis was one of them. His main published statement of it is a 1985 book called The Input Hypothesis: Issues and Implications. Here's the actual idea in plain simple English. Krashen argued that we acquire language when we are exposed to input that is just slightly above our current level. Not way above it, not at it, just slightly beyond. He uses the notation I plus 1. I is where you are right now, plus 1 is the next small step. And his claim was that if the input is comprehensible enough that you can follow the meaning, your brain will naturally absorb the language that's a little beyond you, without you consciously trying to learn it. Now, on its own, this is not a controversial idea. It's actually just common sense applied to learning in general. Think about anything you've ever gotten very good at, maybe a sport, an instrument, even a video game. You improve fastest when the challenge is just slightly above your current skill. Too easy, you get bored. Too hard, you get overwhelmed and you quit. Comprehensible input is that principle, but applied to language learning. And here is why comprehensible input really works, especially at the beginning of your journey. When you're new to English, your brain is starving for patterns. Every time you understand a sentence in a movie, in a song, in a video, even if you don't consciously study it, you're reinforcing rhythm, intonation, common structures, high frequency vocabulary, and over hundreds of hours, this builds a kind of intuition. Students who get a lot of comprehensible input early on tend to sound more natural. Their ear develops. Their brain starts recognizing English as English instead of translating everything from their native language first. So let me be completely clear before I go any further. I'm not here to tell you that comprehensible input is wrong or useless. It is actually one of the most well supported ideas we have in this field. My problem is with what people are doing with it right now on YouTube. Here is what's actually happening. In the last 2 years, I have seen an explosion of new channels built entirely around this term, comprehensible input. Whole brands growing fast with one single promise. You don't have to study. You don't have to force anything. You don't even have to speak. Just expose yourself to enough content and English will naturally click on its own, the same way it did when you were a baby learning your first language. That's the general promise of these channels, either because they're saying that explicitly or implicitly. And I want to be direct with you about why I think this message has been spreading so fast. It's not because it's the most accurate or correct message, but it's because it's the most comfortable message. Think about it. We live in a moment nowadays where people want results without any friction, any effort. Nobody wants to sit down and study grammar exercises. Nobody wants to feel the discomfort of speaking badly, making mistakes in front of others, and being corrected. So, when a video comes along and tells you, relax, you don't have to do any of that. Just watch this show, just listen to this podcast, and one day English will just come out of your mouth. Of course, that message is appealing because it removes the two things people fear the most in language learning: effort and embarrassment. But here's the truth, and I say this after 20 years of watching thousands of real students. The things that actually build a skill, any skill, take time, they take deliberate effort, and yes, sometimes they take discomfort. There is no version of becoming a confident English speaker that skips that part. Comprehensible input feels safer because it asks nothing difficult of you. And that's exactly why, eventually, it stops delivering results. And then you get stuck. I've had students come to me after 1 year, sometimes 2 or 3 years, of doing exactly this. Hours of listening, hours of watching, zero speaking. And they can understand an incredible amount. They understand native speed podcasts, movies without subtitles, all of it. And then I ask them a simple question in English, and they freeze. Because understanding a language and producing it are not the same skill. They live in different parts of your brain, and one doesn't automatically build the other, especially once you're past a certain level. We'll come back to exactly why that happens a little later in the video, but remember this first idea here, okay? Understanding a language and producing it are not the same skill. I can't tell you how many comments I've gotten here on my channel asking me things like, Thiago, if I could understand 95% of your video, what level am I? Oh, Thiago, I can understand 100% of what you say, but when I have to speak, I freeze. These are actually the most popular types of comments I get here on the channel. Why? Because that's exactly what's happening. These learners making these comments, they have probably developed very good comprehensible skills through lots of input. But because they haven't been actively producing language enough, their speaking skills, their production skills are not really in sync with their receptive skills. Now, let me share something personal with you because I really think it adds an important piece of information to this discussion we're having today. If you've been following me here on YouTube for a while, you know a little of my story, don't you? You know how I built my English from scratch in Brazil without ever living abroad, without private tutors early on, without any of the tools you have today. But here's the part I don't think I've told you explicitly before. My journey in English didn't start with input. It actually started with deliberate practice. That's true. I didn't start with input. I started with deliberate practice. The very first thing I did before I ever sat down to watch a movie in English with intention, before I actually leaned into music or series, was grammar. I got some grammar books. I borrowed some grammar books, and every day I would sit down and study the tenses. Present simple versus present continuous. When to use one, when to use the other. What each tense actually communicates. I would study the page, do the exercises in the book, and then flip it to the back to check my own answers. And I did that for a good while at the beginning. Can you believe that? My English journey actually started with a grammar book and a pencil, not with a movie or a song. So I started with deliberate practice, not input. But of course, at some point I realized something. I realized that I understood the rules. I could even explain the present perfect in detail. But I had never really heard it. I didn't know what it sounded like in the mouth of a real speaker, at real speed, in a real sentence. So that was when I started deliberately incorporating input, DVDs, movies, series, music, not passively in the background, but deliberately, looking for the grammar I had studied showing up in the real world. I was actively hunting for the language I was learning from the books. And I'm actually glad it happened in that order for me, because here's what this gave me. To this day, I have an extremely solid grasp of English grammar, not a vague, intuitive feeling for it, but a real structural understanding of exactly what each tense does and when to use it. That foundation I have is definitely part of what makes me effective as a teacher today, because I built the frame first and then I filled it in with real language, with input. Now, I'm not telling you this to say that deliberate practice first is the correct order and input first is the wrong order. I don't believe in that either. I'm telling you this because it proves something important. Listen closely. There isn't one correct sequence, and there isn't one correct ingredient. What there is a combination, and depending on your personality, your goals, your learning style, your current level, that combination might look different from mine. What it can't be, listen closely to this, what it cannot be for any of us is just one ingredient forever. Here's my core argument for this whole episode, and I want to state it as clearly as I can. Listen very closely. Comprehensible input works, but for most learners, it works reliably from A1 up to somewhere around B1, beginner to solid intermediate. In that range, it is really one of your best tools because your brain is absorbing rhythm, high frequency vocabulary, natural phrasing, and yes, even some grammar patterns just from exposure. And if you are at that stage, in those more elementary levels of English, just keep doing it because it's working for you. And if you have a real aptitude for languages, because some people are naturally good at picking up sound patterns faster than others. If you are that type of person, you might even stretch that into B2 territory with only input. I've seen that happening. But one thing I've seen consistently over 20 years and with hundreds of real students, including the talented students, everybody plateaus. Everybody. Because from B2 onward, input by itself is not enough. Not ideal. Not enough. A few reasons, and this isn't just my opinion. This actually lines up with what the research actually shows us. First, production reveals gaps that passive exposure never will. When you're only listening and reading, you can feel like you understand everything. And in a sense, you do. But understanding and producing draw on different resources in your brain. You don't discover that you don't actually know how to conjugate a certain verb, for example, or that you forget a preposition, until you actually try it in a sentence, until you actually try to say it in a sentence. Input alone doesn't create pressure. And without pressure, there is no discovery of your gaps. Second, without production, you get no feedback. And feedback is how any skill improves. If you never speak or write, nobody, not even your brain, can tell you what's wrong. You can listen to native speakers for 1,000 hours and still not know if your own sentence, the one you actually produce in a conversation, in a meeting, in an interview, is correct. Because feedback requires output. There's no way around that. You can listen to Beethoven for 1,000 hours. Still, that doesn't make you able to sit down and play Beethoven. Have you thought about that? You can watch someone drive a car for 1,000 hours. Still, that doesn't mean you can drive a car until you actually sit behind the wheel and start actually driving the thing. So, consuming something, observing someone doing something, is not the same as actually doing it. Third, and this one surprised me when I first came across the research, speaking engages your brain differently than listening does. Listening mostly activates the auditory parts of your brain, but when you speak, you're also engaging motor pathways, which is literally the physical act of producing the sounds. The more parts of your brain involved in learning something, the deeper that learning gets encoded, and the more likely you are to actually remember and reuse it under pressure when it really matters. Passive listening on its own just doesn't build that same depth of learning. And fourth, real fluency isn't just vocabulary and grammar, it's the ability to negotiate meaning in real time. Choosing a simple word when you don't know the exact one, rephrasing in the moment when someone doesn't understand you. These are strategic skills, and you cannot develop strategy by watching only. You develop it by being in the situation and having to find a solution, a way out of it. So, this is the wall. Input got you understanding the language, but it didn't build the muscle to actually use it effectively. In 1985, the same decade Krashen published his input hypothesis, a researcher named Merrill Swain was studying something interesting happening in Canada: French immersion programs. Kids in these programs were getting years of rich, comprehensible input in French. They were listening to French, reading, they were really immersed in the classroom. And by every measure of comprehension, they were excellent. They understood French at near native level. But when the same students spoke or wrote in French, their language was noticeably flawed, grammatically off, non-native like, despite all that input. Swain's explanation became known as the output hypothesis, and it was built as a direct rebuttal to Krashen. Her core claim was this: comprehensible input alone cannot get you to full competence. You also need comprehensible output, being pushed to produce language, not just consume it. And she identified specifically why output does something input can't. One, output forces you to notice. The moment you try to say something and realize you don't know a word, or you don't have enough words, or you don't know the structure, you notice the exact gap in your knowledge, precisely in the moment you need it, not in some abstract way. Two, output lets you test your hypotheses. Every time you speak, you're essentially guessing. You're saying to yourself, well, I think this phrase is going to work. I think this word is going to work. And depending on the response you get, that's going to tell you whether your guess was right or wrong. That process of guessing and confirming is how real internalization happens. Three, and this is the most I think matters most for where you are right now. Output forces full grammatical processing. When you're just following meaning while listening to something, your brain can skip a lot of grammatical detail and still understand the main idea of that passage. But when you have to produce a sentence yourself, you can't skip it. You have to actually assemble the structure in your mind. That's a completely different level of cognitive work. And it's the work that builds real command, real domain of the language. This is exactly why input without output, in my opinion, is meaningless past a certain point. Not because input is wrong, but it's just because it's half the equation. You have to interact with what you receive. You have to create with it. I talk about being an active learner all the time here on the channel, and this is exactly why. Passive consumption caps out. It has a ceiling. Active production is what pushes you through that ceiling. And to be clear, production doesn't mean you need a conversation partner from day one. Not really. You can start with speaking to yourself, shadowing a video out loud, writing a journal entry. Then it moves to more structured practice. And eventually, it has to include real interaction with real people, because that is our negotiation of meaning, adjusting, rephrasing, recovering from a misunderstanding actually happens. And the real interaction piece is exactly why I built the Fluency Hub. The Fluency Hub is my paid community where you get regular live conversation sessions with real hosts, practicing exactly the kind of real-time production we're talking about. Not scripted, not passive, but real back and forth English under light social pressure, which is honestly the safest place to start feeling that pressure before you feel it in a job interview or in a real meeting. If input has taken you as far as it can, and you know you need to start producing more English, that's where I would send you. So, if you want to learn more about the community, link in the description. But there's a third piece of this puzzle. So far, we have discussed Krashen's input hypothesis and then Swain's output hypothesis, but there is a third piece to this puzzle, and it's one that I don't see getting talked about often: deliberate practice. Deliberate practice is about sitting down and actually studying for real. Grammar, the structures, the vocabulary you know you're missing, pronunciation. And this isn't just my opinion as a teacher. There's a well-known research synthesis from 2000 by Norris and Ortega, published in the journal Language Learning, that looked across dozens of studies comparing explicit instruction, which is actually teaching and drilling structures directly, against purely implicit exposure-based approaches like comprehensible input. The finding was clear. Focused instruction produced larger, lasting gains, and explicit instruction consistently outperformed purely implicit exposure. And these gains held up over time, not just immediately after the study session. In other words, taking the time to sit down and deliberately, intentionally study a certain grammar structure, a certain piece of vocabulary, a certain sound to improve your pronunciation actually generates real gains in your development. And why does this matter, especially for you, the learner at B1 and B2 level? Because at this stage, you've likely developed patterns, ways of speaking that work well enough to communicate, but that are grammatically off in specific repeated ways. Maybe you don't use articles as well as you should. Maybe it's your prepositions. Maybe it's a tense you consistently avoid because you're not confident with it. And here's the truth: input alone won't fix this, because you can listen to correct English for years and still not consciously notice the specific gap in your own speech. And even output alone won't always fix it, because you can keep making the same mistake fluently over and over without anyone flagging it. It's what I call the becoming very good at incorrect English. I find that many learners become fluent in English, but they become fluent at speaking incorrect English. So output for output's sake may not be enough either. So what do you need? Deliberate practice. Deliberate practice is what closes that specific gap. It's the part where you actually stop, look at your own mistakes, isolate the structure you're avoiding, and drill it, study it with intention, a little at a time, until it starts showing up naturally in your own speech or in your own writing. This is the piece that connects back to my own story. Remember, I started with exactly this: deliberate grammar study, before I ever built fluency through input and output. And that early deliberate foundation is a big part of why I have the command of English grammar I have today. I'm not saying you need to start there just like I did. I'm saying you cannot skip this part forever. You cannot skip deliberate practice forever. Here's what I want you to take away from this entire episode. More than any single piece of research I've mentioned here today, listen very closely. There is no one right way to learn a language. There never has been. Over the decades, dozens of serious linguists and researchers have studied this from different angles, and they've each found real, valid pieces of the puzzle. Krashen with input, Swain with output, and plenty of others on deliberate instruction and practice. Each piece is true. None of them is the whole truth by itself. So here's my advice, and I want you to actually remember this. If you ever come across a video here on YouTube or on the internet that tells you that one single approach is the only thing you need, be skeptical. If someone tells you comprehensible input is the only way and everything else is a waste of time, that's not science. That's a hook designed to get you to click and stay comfortable. And if someone on the opposite end tells you just studying grammar alone or speaking from day one alone is the only way, the same warning applies. So run from absolute claims. Nobody who has actually studied this seriously makes them. So run from absolute claims. What actually works, based on the research and based on my 20 years of teaching and watching real students go from stuck to fluent, is a mix of approaches. Comprehensible input to build your ear and intuition, especially early on. Comprehensible output to force you to actually use what you're absorbing and discover your real gaps in the language. And deliberate practice to close those specific gaps once you know exactly what they are. Not one instead of the other, all three, and knowing when to lean on each one depending on where you are. Depending on where you are in your journey, you should prioritize one or the other. Like I said, At beginner stages, I think comprehensible input should be the priority. And then once you get comfortable enough speaking your first sentences, focus more on output, having real conversations, talking to yourself, shadowing videos. That's going to develop your production fluency, let's say. But then once you are at the level most of you are right now, stuck at that intermediate plateau, you understand a lot of English, you can even communicate well enough, but you know that you have gaps, you know that there's more to do, but you don't know what it is. Now it's the time to apply deliberate practice. First, being aware of what your mistakes, your recurring mistakes are, what your gaps are, and then working deliberately, applying deliberate practice to fix those mistakes once and for all. That way, you can break through the plateau and reach C1 and C2 levels of proficiency in English. So here's where that leaves you. If you have been relying on comprehensible input alone, and you're honest with yourself, like real honest, you'll probably know by now that comprehensible input has taken you as far as it could. That's not failure, that's just the nature of that tool. The gap for you now is more production and deliberate correction. And that gap won't close on its own, no matter how many more hours of listening you add. So if you're serious about actually closing your gaps and getting to a solid B2 level and beyond, not just understanding English, but actually living in it, I offer a Fluency Discovery call. That's a real one-on-one session with me on Zoom where we assess exactly where your English stands now, and we build a specific plan from there. It's not for everyone, and that's fine, but if you're serious, that link is in the description too. Look, you now understand something most learners never get told clearly. Comprehensible input, comprehensible output, and deliberate practice are not competing methods. They are three tools for three different jobs. You can go figure out on your own how to combine them, piece by piece, through real trial and error. Or if you want a straight answer on exactly where you are right now with your English and exactly what you personally need, maybe you need more input, more output, deliberate practice, or a mix of all three, just book a Fluency Discovery call with me directly. We're going to go through your English together. I'm going to interview you, get to know you better, and then I'm going to point you to where you should focus on next. Link in the description. I'm Thiago. I'm signing off. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I hope this video was helpful to you and it was clarifying. If you still have any questions about, these topics we discussed today, comprehensible input, comprehensible output, deliberate practice, post your comment here under the video and I'll be glad to read it and reply it. And of course, subscribe to the channel if you're not a subscriber yet. Thank you so much, and I'll talk to you very soon in an upcoming video.